you've already seen the confessions. I had the list of that earlier to you, so that's already been in front of you. The Heidelberg Catechism is basically, like many catechisms, it is a fundamental statement that was used in offering Calvinistic theology at the church level. And the church, we've not talked a lot about catechetical instruction in our day and a half together, but let me say, this is a very important way of transmitting truth to the next generation. And the Heidelberg Catechism is lengthy, but it was also used in many churches to train young people, children, in the basics of the Calvinistic tradition. And we used to, as Methodists, have catechetical instruction, but no longer have it. And I think it's a sad loss.
You got any go-to books for that?
I mean, titles I can give to you right off the top of my head?
The
The only one I know of was written by Matt Friedemann in recent years. And I forget the name of it. It's a small little thing. But
like books that's like catechism, actual catechisms that
well,
you might incorporate in discipleship.
Just look it up, because they're not going to be printed very recently. You have to find it online, but just I can't think of any right off the bat. You're talking about Methodist related ones? Yeah. I can't think of any. That would be a standalone book. Normally they come in books of discipline. So for your denomination, you'll have that, but in the middle of that, you'll have a catechism that outlines 27, 40 points to be transmitted to your children. I've got one in my discipline in my church, so there's no standalone book. But it's in the discipline itself. Yeah. Actually, I think the EMC does have a catechism book that was just produced a couple of years ago. I mean, I can show you that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Remind me. Okay. Now let's get to Beza. I've got in your handout here, the support materials, about 5 or 6 pages of primary source material. It's been edited because of the wordiness of it. We won't have time to read it today, but many people have never read Theodore Beza on double predestination. So what you've got here, it's the extra materials that Brian just copied for you there. What you've got here is primary source material so that you know that I am not overstating the case out of my critique of Beza. All right? Everything I'm going to say about him is supported by these materials. And it's not chosen out of line. These are the successive argument, chapters 1, 2, and 3. So you might want to just see on the first page that he starts his argumentation by saying in his book, The Perseverance of the Saints, St. Augustine says. So that gives you something of the background. Not that Beza is not biblical, but he starts with St. Augustine in a period of time in St. Augustine's ministry when he was strongly Traditionarian, not other times when he was not strongly Traditionarian, but they start there. And you'll also notice, which I find very interesting, that most of the biblical references in these pages are almost all out of Romans chapter 8. Almost all of them. Not everyone, but almost all of them. Of course, Ephesians 1 is another one, Romans 8. So the primary focus is out of one sector of the Bible, one chapter of the Bible, and from one theologian primarily, Augustine. That tells you something about the theological trajectory that this particular group of believers had. Now, Beza was, as I think your outline shows you, the son-in-law of Calvin. I'm not sure that makes any difference in what you believe, but that put him pretty close to Calvin. And he was a brilliant lawyer, educated in France, who became a Protestant after a long period of illness, came to the Lord. He moved from law to teaching Greek, so he knew Greek very well. And why I mention him, and I'm intrigued this is the last few minutes of our class today, which I never intend that to happen, but just we've had great discussion and engagement. We're going to go as long as we could and then just be done. I wanted to end with Wesley, which is the apex of all thought. But anyway, we can't end there. So this is an interesting end for me. But must be predestined. He is the bridge between Calvin, who, although I have strong reservations with some of Calvin, most of Calvin I deeply, deeply love. I've read the Institutes at least twice, maybe 3 times, and every time through I am blessed. The majority of it is astounding pastoral theology. Brilliant, out of a 27-year-old mind. Absolutely brilliant pastoral theology. He wrote it to help preachers speak doctrinally to their people. So it's a great gift to the church. Astounding gift. But I've told many of my classes, and it was a life-changing day for me, when I looked in the, and of course I don't know if there's still one where you can check the actual term, but in the volume that I was reading, the volumes, I have 2 volumes, well-worn volumes, and in those volumes, I looked for the first reference to predestination in the Institutes. And in my version, the first term use of the word in the books, was in the 2nd volume. So there were 900 pages in the first volume. The 2nd volume had another 800 pages. And the first use of the word predestination occurred on page 1005 of my 2-volume set. And I had been told all of my life that Calvin was the predominant focus on this issue of predestination, and I believed it. Because my Wesleyan people told me, Calvin started it, it's his fault, and we've gone amok since that time period. Well, I believe that, because I was told that by everybody. But I didn't find it in Calvin. I didn't find him talking about it at all. Talked about theological method, and the Bible, and grace, and how God woos us to himself, and long passages of scriptural interpretation, and then this statement. It almost came out of nowhere. I mean, I still to this day, the logic of it doesn't quite seem for me to flow. As a Methodist, of course it doesn't, but he was talking about how we can actually understand how the benefits of Christ come to us. That was the argument. How do the benefits of Christ, how do they come toward us from heaven? How do we receive them? And he began his discussion by this concept of predestination. When I was reading Beza, I went back to my issue that we started last night with the Westminster Confession, and I did the work myself. And it doesn't take lots because Calvin is so clear. But he has 4 basic books, Calvin does. So I'm moving from Calvin to Beza now. The 4 basic books for Calvin in the Institutes is, first of all, God. That's the first book. Second book is Christ. So you've got some Trinitarian talk there, but not a lot. He believed in the Trinity, of course, but not a lot of deep discussion of that. The third book is salvation. And that's where the first use of predestination occurred at page 1005 for me in the third book. And then the fourth book is on ecclesiology and last things. So if you want the Institute's basic systematic outline, that's what it is: ecclesiology and last things. All right. What I found in... Oh, let me say one more thing. This is not meant to be a systematic. I've already said it's pastoral theology. That's what he intended to be, not a systematic theology. We make it that, but he never intended it to be that. It is systematic in its writing. It's very logical in its orientation. But his major focus was not speculation. It's how to apply biblical truth to people's lives. So, he's pastoral. When you get to Beza, you're moving now into Reformed Orthodoxy. All right? So as early on as his son-in-law, Calvin is no longer writing, he's no longer in charge. Beza now is a major leader in the church. He takes the discussion that occurs in book 3 on a few pages, and it's not a sustained argument. It's not something that goes throughout the entire text. It starts there, and it does pop up, and there are some shocking paragraphs, like double predestination, that occur in this segment. But again, it's not a systematic principle, it seems to me, for Calvin. Beza takes that doctrine and puts it virtually in the first paragraphs of his theology. So what Calvin does not do, Beza does. We talked yet last night about Westminster Confession and the shift between the Trinity and Scripture, when you put Scripture first. Now you've got another element, and that is to take predestination and put that prior to everything else, doctrinally. So the fundamental thing that you start with in your theology is predestining grace, predestination from God's own eternal will or mind. And that is a definite Orthodox movement and a scholastic movement that I think would have made Calvin roll in his grave, personally. I don't find anything in Calvin that is anywhere as strong as Beza's sustained argument in these pages. And if you've not read Beza, how many of you have read Beza? Have you not read it? Well, I'll save you the time of me reading it too. But let's just look real quickly here. I think you can dive in anywhere. Let's see. Okay, let's take an example. They're not numbered pages, so that I don't want to waste time. We don't have time to waste. Let's look at the page which starts, reprobation is unconditional. So keep flipping through. At the very top, in capital letters, reprobation is unconditional. You there? You see it? You got it? All right. Likewise, when mention is made of the damnation of the reprobate, whose entire fault lies within themselves, yet notwithstanding, sometimes when need requires, in order to make more manifest by this comparison the great power of God's patience and the riches of his glory toward the vessels of mercy. So you can hear the Romans material in that. Riches of his glory toward the vessels of mercy. Scripture leads us into this high secret, which by order is the first cause of their damnation. So he's saying it's our fault, we sin, but because of God's glory in the secret determinations of God, he must be the first cause of everything. He doesn't cause sin, but he's the first cause of all that is, in this secret, glorious riches of his will, for which no other cause is known to men, but only his just will, which we must with all reverence obey, since it comes from him, who is justice personified, and cannot by any means or by any man in any way be comprehended. We must place a distinction between the purpose or ordinance of reprobation and reprobation itself. His secret purpose is to reprobate is hidden from us. We know the secondary causes of reprobation and damnation are as expressed in God's word: corruption, lack of faith, iniquity. That's our fault. These attributes are both necessary and voluntarily committed by vessels made to dishonor. Have you had enough? I mean, you get the feel. So that when you can't answer the question, the particular movement of, Calvin started it, yes, but Beza instantiates it. He solidifies it. It's moved into a secret will that is unknowable to us because God is unknowable. And in this secret, hidden place in God, even though it may not look to us like it's just, he is just, cannot be unjust, so this is just. And he says that in a variety of ways, over and over again. Now, he will talk about our part in this. He will talk, in fact, on the top of the next page, he has a paragraph, God is not the author of sin. Well, you can say that, but in reality, he splits reality into two portions. You've got a God who is beyond our comprehension. So a hidden God, God's hidden will, that we'll never know because he is God, and therefore we never fully understand or can comprehend that. And then you've got the expressed will of God. And that's where we live. So he can reprobate whom he wants to, but here is where we're responsible to logically connect ourselves. We disobey. We have been unfaithful. Therefore, we are condemned. But he already knows that by reprobating us prior to our creation, to our conception. It's eternal. It's an eternal thing. My point simply is this, is that in scholasticism, you have a hardening of the arteries of most dynamic movements. And you have a pastoral theology which is now systematized into a logical flow of thought which takes a minimal doctrine to Calvin. It was minimal. And if you read the Institutes, I think you'll agree with me. It is not central. God's glory is central, but not predestination. And it's taken, that point is taken and made the predominant statement about God in relationship to everything else. And I think the results of that are, we're still feeling in the West. Let me do this in the last 3 minutes, all right? Let's do Arminius, just so we can end with a note that's more close to hope. All right? I wish we could take more time with Beza, but let's leave it there. Let me say one more thing about Beza. It is a deeply speculative doctrine. Deeply speculative. For Calvin, I think he was more pastoral, as I've said, more functional, more pragmatic, more down to earth. Orthodoxy tends to take these real, vibrant, vital issues and moves them up into some esoteric discussion. That seems to always kill dynamic Christian thought. It seems to me. I love high thinking, I love philosophy, but I don't love it that much. When it kills the dynamic of God in people's lives, it really is not, it's not worth much.
Dr. Uri, just real quick.
Yeah.
Was there any further development in Calvin beyond his 27-year-old work that caused him to have gone into that trajectory of speculativeness?
Well, if there is, I can't remember it.
Okay, so...
I can't. Yeah, I don't think he ever did, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have sermons, we have commentaries, maybe a few essays. I can't think of anything else that would be as systematic as his Institutes. Do you know something? No? Yeah. Now, again, I've not read all of it. He wrote a lot. And it's like a shelf of books. A shelf of books. So I may have missed something. But I don't think so.
All Basil's fault.
Yeah, let's blame Basil. Yeah. Now again, let me say the paragraphs in book 3 make me blanch. I mean, I'm thinking, where in the world did that come from? And it's interesting, if you do the research, I think it all goes back to Augustine. They all go back to Augustine as their father on this issue. And we look at Augustine, my argument is, he wasn't consistent in his life at all on this issue. It was later in his life, when he was an angry bishop, worried about the church being lost to the Donatists and other the marauding northern tribes that were coming south to wreck the Roman Empire. I think it was a very, very bad time in his life, and he was trying to secure some things. So I'm just intrigued how often these later documents by Augustine are used as the final statement of the church on issues in which he was not. 420 is different than 526. 526, the church critiques what he wrote in 420 and said, no, we have a free will. Not free to save ourselves, but a free will, and God's sovereign, but not that sovereign. So both Augustinians and Pelagians, if you take your authors to the end of what they're saying, you're outside of Christian tradition. You're not thinking with us. This is the center. This is where we are safe to talk. So when Beza starts with Augustine's Perseverance of the Saints, already I've clicked him off. That's not the place to start your argumentation if you're going to give a full orbed Christian perspective. That's a very narrow perspective, which tells me already you've already got an agenda, at least from my perspective. All right. Now, Arminius, as you recall, was a Christian who lived in Holland. His name was a very different name than that, but anyway, he was a lawyer again. Everybody's a lawyer until they meet Jesus. Then they become a theologian. Isn't that right? Okay, so, yeah. Let me say this. Maybe you've forgotten this, or maybe you read it and just passed you by. He was not at the Council of Dort. He died before the Council of Dort. But his arguments were maintained and taken through by some of his colleagues into that very important council or synod. The group of people that react to high Calvinism are called remonstrants or remonstrants. And there are a lot of remonstrants, which means people who remonstrate, who critique, who are disagreeing. But the remonstrants, the literature is unbelievable. And again, I've said this for 20 years of teaching. I've tried to get my students to think about this, but if you want a good PhD project, there's still, as far as I know, no one who's gone into this remonstrant literature and figured out the basic elements of how they formed their thought, We all know about Arminius, but there are lots of people in England and in Holland who are opposed to high Calvinism, the Calvinist Orthodoxy. And it may be just as too hard to discern or read or understand, I'm not sure, but I was in a library where I worked for a year in northern Minnesota, and went to the bottom floor of the basement and looked down an aisle, and I saw these red covered books as far as the eye could see. It must have been 40 yards until the wall. It was way into the dark. And I looked on the side of the red volumes, and they were all like 3 inches wide. And it said remonstrant literature, remonstrant literature, remonstrant literature. Now, I didn't check them all. There may be some Catholics, and I don't know, but I'm just telling you, there's a huge cavern of material from this period that I don't know of anybody's accessed. I've never seen a book on it. A really solid book on the history of the remonstrance in this period of time. Arminius, yes, but hardly anybody else. So, anyway, that's to encourage you or somebody else in the days to come. Hopefully someone will pick up the suggestion sometime and do something about it. So, you've got these people who at the Synod of Dort are not undercutting, they are confronting high Calvinism as we've seen in Basel. So you've got a challenge to Calvinistic orthodoxy in Holland in 1618 and 1619. Now, I don't have to rehearse the tulip for you. You've all known that and preached it and taught it and learned it here in this marvelous school. So that's marvelous for me not to have to rehearse all of that. But it was a distinct theological confrontation. And if you don't have time to read Arminius, which I hope you do, but if you don't, and would like a synopsis of his major points, he does have a piece which has an interesting title called The Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments. It is about a 15-page summation of his major points. The synod was held, and the remonstrants were condemned, not to death, but they were condemned, meaning you are bound for hell because of your rejection of our Calvinistic orthodoxy, and the separation and division began there. And to this day, the Arminians and the Calvinists have had an ongoing debate that has been sometimes very, very strong and sometimes less vociferous. When I was studying in Jackson, I had a chance to have lunch many, many times with the theologians from RTS. And they would say things to me like this. They would say, "We'd love to have you come and preach in our chapel. Could you just become a Calvinistic Methodist? Couldn't you become like the guys that Wesley knew? If you could become like them, like George Whitefield, we would love to have you come." Now, they came to our seminary almost maybe once every 2 years to speak or teach or share or whatever. But they would never allow us to come that way to teach. I did teach once in a class, but to preach in chapel, because we are viewed as heretics. We don't believe in the full sovereignty of God. So it's intriguing to be treated like that by other evangelicals.
They actually hold that we would go to hell.
I don't know if they would say that. That'd be God's determination anyway.
No, it doesn't seem like a salvific issue to me.
Yeah. Well,
I mean,
yeah.
oh, maybe it is.
Yeah. Yeah, well, for us it's an opinion. For them it's a doctrine. So I think they leave that in the Lord's hands. I don't know nobody ever treated me like that. They're going to hell. But what a heretic? I don't know. Do all heretics go to hell? Is that what the deal is? Anyway. Okay, so I think you've picked up my spirit of orthodoxy and how I basically would say that we must be very careful. And thus, in the next few pages, and we're going to stop right here, Pietism is one of the movements that comes in reaction to orthodoxy, Pietism, and out of Pietism comes the Moravian tradition, which directly connects us to Wesley. So now a reaction to the orthodoxy of the Lutheran tradition, the Calvinist tradition and the Catholic tradition comes this European flood of people saying we have got to get back to the preaching of the gospel and the addition of, through the Pietists, there must be a moment in your life when you are born again. Now, I don't know if anybody talked like that before the Pietists, but I can't find that in Christian thought. Somebody may have preached it, I can't find it. The Pietists called this ictic conversion, which means at a moment you can be transformed. Ictic conversion. And that flow of thought deeply impacts a huge section of the disenchanted Lutherans, disenchanted Calvinists, and other groups in Europe that say we've got to come back to a personal relationship with Jesus, where seminaries and schools of thought have produced nothing but dry, dusty, theological statements that are highly philosophized. We've got to move back to the center of the gospel. And from that then, by 1738, we have John Wesley saying, from that whole tradition, I have been an Anglican priest. I've seen what Anglican Orthodoxy has done, what seminaries have become. I am not saved. And through a Moravian missionary and others, he is discipled in the pietistic tradition to offer himself to Christ by reading a commentary by Martin Luther on the book of Romans, or having it read to him in his hearing. The same thing happened with Charles before John by the reading of the book of the commentary of Galatians. So Luther's commentaries are a part of their spiritual transformation. So you've got, again, a movement that begins in a person's heart, and you and I have touched on the implications of that in the modern period, where we are today. Whether we're monuments or not, I don't know. But I would encourage you to not allow that to occur to the exclusion of the preaching and the living of the gospel.